So, my name's Rabia. I'm here because I believe that now more than ever, Muslims can and need to reclaim secularism. I've worked with British Muslims for secular democracy for almost 2 years now as the Director of Media, Engagement and Lobbying, and our organisation believes that secularism is a force for good, and British Muslims should have a say in it. Let me give you a short background on BMS democracy and what has led me to speak on this topic. My predecessor, Tamina Kazi, has been in this role for over 7 years. The challenges she faced were usually from conservative Muslims who found the concept of secularism and Islam unfathomable. She experienced unwarranted abuse when calling out harmful cultural practices, but was welcomed with open arms by mainstream secular movements. Over time, we carved out a space for ourselves in the secular movement. We established ourselves as one of the leading secular Muslim voices in Britain. The opposition to our organisation declined. Now, 10 years later, we're facing a quite different set of challenges. The political landscape is changing. The far right is transnational and organised. Every day brings new reports of increasing anti-Muslim sentiment and hate crime. All of this against the backdrop of an ever-growing divide between communities in Britain. And that was just my first day. As part of my job, I do outreach into British Muslim communities of various stripes. I was surprised at how secularism was received by liberal and like-minded Muslims. The way it was received was badly. I remember one occasion particularly well. I was at a Hidayah discussion event, my very first actually. People of different identities and varying religiosities were in attendance. I remember hearing the stories and struggles of Muslims of all backgrounds that struggled with balancing their faith and sexuality. It was a wonderfully eye-opening event that really portrayed the raw intersectionality of LGBTQ+ Muslims. Because this environment really allowed for people to be vulnerable in front of each other, naturally a sense of allyship and bonds were formed. However, near the end, when I introduced who I was and which organisation I worked for, eyebrows were raised and I felt the atmosphere chill towards me. At the very end of the event, people were curious as to who BMS Democracy are. Those that knew who we were spoke about why they found the wider secularist movement problematic. I found that many people believe that secularism equals atheism. Now, it is true that the secular movement may have sprung from atheism, but it doesn't mean it only belongs to atheists. A lot of Muslims also associate the concept with France, a contentious country for minorities and Muslims because of their implementation of secularism. Now, I won't get into the French Constitution, but when a woman is held at gunpoint for what she is wearing out of her own free will, something has gone horribly wrong. The French pride themselves on liberté, on freedom. I call bullshit. That's not freedom, that's chauvinism. It's also not British secularism as I understand it. We operate on a procedural secularism, a secularism that allows all people of various identities, beliefs and religions to access and participate in the public sphere equally. This model of secularism ensures religious freedom. It is therefore entirely possible for one to be secular and Muslim and British. Myself and my organisation are living proof of that. We are, after all, British Muslims for secular democracy. From hearing me talk, you could easily assume that I was born in the Midlands. That is not the case. I was actually born in Pakistan. Pakistan has one of the worst track records for human rights and sectarianism, blasphemy laws, violence against women, and violence against religious minorities. This hasn't always been the case, though. The founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, was a staunch secularist and envisioned Pakistan to be a secular country. In his first presidential address to the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan, he said, "You may belong to any religion or caste or creed. That has nothing to do with the business of the state." He believed it would ensure an inclusive and impartial government, rule of law and equality for all, regardless of an individual's faith. It was, in short, a promise of a thriving, pluralist democracy, cut short by his death a year after Pakistan was created. He died of tuberculosis, fun fact. In 1978, the Islamist dictator Zia ul-Haq was elected. Under his rule, we saw Sharia benches and the Federal Sharia Court. We saw the replacement of parts of the Pakistan Penal Code with the 1979 Hudud Ordinance, laws which particularly hampered women's rights. Under him, madrasas received state funding, most of them from the Deobandi and Wahhabi school of thought. Jinnah's dream, that religion has nothing to do with the business of the state, was clearly over. Despite this downbeat conclusion, there's a good reason why I've chosen this example. It's because of the many Pakistanis and Muslims that live in Britain today that can find some solace knowing that secularism isn't just a Western endeavour. We have an equal right to advocate secularism. So why in the UK do so many Muslims disavow it? Conservative Muslims are against secularism because they see secularism as a threat to their religious freedom. It's not. Quite the opposite. Secularism allows everyone to practice their religion freely. The growing group of Muslims that I'm more concerned about are those that I would consider not conventionally pious. They're actively engaged in social justice and politics, supportive of secular principles, often without realising, but totally dismissive of the mainstream secular movement. Remember the group of liberal, like-minded Muslims I mentioned earlier? Hadaya. I want to read you a couple of quotes from that group about secularism, anonymous, of course. Secularists understand our sexuality, but misunderstand our relationship with our faith. Not only are we forced to choose between our faith and our sexuality by community members, we're also forced to choose by secular activists. I know secularists are supportive of my sexuality, but feel they appropriate our identity to further an anti-Muslim agenda. They only care about the gay part. One last comment stopped me in my tracks. The secularist movement is Islamophobic. End of. The reason it stopped me in my tracks is not because I believe it's true, but because I don't wholly believe it's false. Secularism doesn't have high priests or caliphs, of course. It does, however, have some problematic leading lights from the new atheist movements. Dawkins, Ali, Harris. They may have started out with good intentions, but the movement has morphed into something quite ugly. Allying with the far-right parties and movements, calling for policies that are antithetical to human rights and co-opting harmful, dehumanizing narratives and conspiracy theories about Muslims, which we're still fighting off today. Here are some reasons why people might think the secularist movement is Islamophobic and anti-Muslim. Let me read you some quotes from some of these leading lights. We are not at war with terrorism. We are at war with Islam. This is not to say that we are at war with all Muslims, but we are absolutely at war with millions more than have any direct affiliation with Al-Qaeda. Next quote. The same failure of liberalism is evident in Western Europe, where the dogma of multiculturalism has left secular Europe very slow to address the looming problem of religious extremism among immigrants. The people who speak most sensibly about the threat that Islam poses to Europe are actually fascists. You here in the UK are in danger. Of course, you can't ban Islam outright, but you need to stop the spread of the ideology. Stop native Westerners converting to Islam. such wise beacons of liberalism and free thinking. These are prominent figures that have wide international reach. Let me read you some excerpts published by a leading secular organisation in the UK on the recent report on Islamophobia published by the All-Party Parliamentary Group of British Muslims. Start quote. And do the authors not think we should point out that Muslim theocracies push propaganda in an attempt to convince Muslims that British society hates them? Here's another. Meanwhile, it's becoming increasingly difficult to get on a train, turn on the TV, or go to a bookshop without being patronised on Islam. A recently launched poster campaign tells members of the public it's not just offensive, it's an offence, reinforcing the message that the British public cannot be trusted to treat their fellow citizens who happen to have a different religion with respect. Another quote. The report regularly attacks the press and uncritically mentions that community representatives have called for accountability of the media. Hidden within this report is a power grab, and that power grab could reach into every area of British life, as the report repeatedly refers to the apparent problem of institutional Islamophobia. This relativist idea suggests the need for a wholesale change in British society to accommodate Muslims and lets Muslim culture off the hook for the problems Muslims face. These quotes display an egregious misunderstanding of real concerns Muslims hold in Britain, a conspiratorial view of the very real notion of institutional Islamophobia and a denial of media bias and outright lies that have been evidenced in the hundreds, if not thousands now, actually. Secularists in the media are overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly former Christians or atheists. They've bought in to repeat the same tired tropes, that the hijab is anti-feminist, that Islam is a uniquely violent religion and has a close propensity to terrorism. So you can see why, as a Muslim, if I were to start thinking about secularism, I wouldn't think I'd find a home in the secular movement. I'm actually quite proud that British Muslims for Secular Democracy supports the definition of Islamophobia put forward by the APPG of British Muslims. I think we're the only secular organisation to do so. But my organisation isn't the only one that is trying to bridge the divide between communities in Britain. Jeremy Riddell, a dialogue officer of Humanist UK, was one of the first people to reach out to me when I started this post. He made it clear that work needed to be done to reach out to communities to start an important dialogue about pluralism, harmony, and human rights. Humanist UK are making strong steps toward this through their outreach, but I'm sure you can speak to Jeremy later on about that. BMS Democracy are still dedicated to supporting minority Muslim voices, a campaign we created to support voices of dissent from the mainstream Muslim communities of Britain. Currently, we are working in collaboration with Hadaya, who are a fantastic LGBT plus Muslim organisation that have set up support networks up and down the country, and Drew's actually speaking later on today. We've set up four roundtable discussion events to create space for an important dialogue around LGBT Muslims. We continue our work to support dissenting voices, support our schools in handling religious opposition to parts of the curriculum, and continue to deliver our democracy workshops to empower Muslim women. As I've shown, there are some problematic areas of the secular movement. I can believe that's why young Muslims might see the secular movement as Islamophobic. However, I believe that many Muslims today are already secular. They just don't realise it. Fundamental values of pluralism, tolerance, diversity, and human rights are values shared by a growing number of British Muslims, as they are for the British secular movement. The aim of my talk today was to show that secularism isn't irrelevant. It can support the Muslim struggle through the lens of human rights. It's also imperative we adopt a human rights first approach to supporting minority Muslims, such as women, LGBT Muslims, black Muslims, etc. In conclusion, I believe now is the time to reclaim secularism. I look around me and see people who care deeply about secularism. I know for a fact that we don't all agree on this topic. I'm sure I'll hear more about that later. That we think there are different ways to implement it. I'd like to have those discussions, but I think the most important thing is that we make ourselves visible. I believe we're entitled to influence secularism, to use it as a tool for good, for our liberation and equal rights. And I believe we'll only do that if we're given a space for our whole selves. We are British, we are secular, and we are, of course, Muslims. Thank you very much.